Stone. I'm the Dean of Perkins School of Theology. I'm here to welcome you back this afternoon from the last lecture. I have the privilege of introducing our 2025 Tate-Wilson lecturer, Dr. Almeda Wright. And she will be joined by Perkins' own Dr. Tamara Lewis, professor of the practice of historical theology. Oh, there you are. So Reverend Dr. Almeda M. Wright is a tenured associate professor of religious education at Yale Divinity School. Dr. Wright's research focuses on African American religion and education, womanist spirituality, adolescent spiritual development, and the intersections of religion and public life. Dr. Wright recently launched Communitas, a young adult ministry innovation hub at Yale. This work centers BIPOC young adults and attempts to create working space for the creation of spiritual communities that connect young adult leaders with congregations and community partners. She's also the co-principal investigator for the Connector Project, a partnership with Eastern Mennonite University to empower parents and caregivers in their efforts to create more secure bonds with their children and to explore ways of sharing their faith and values with their children. Professor Wright's publications include Teaching to Live, Black Religion, Activist Educators, and Radical Social Change, 2024, The Spiritual Lives of Young African Americans, 2017, and a co-edited book with Mary Elizabeth Moore, Children, Youth, and Spirituality in a Troubled World. Prior to her arrival at Yale, Dr. Wright served as Assistant Professor of Religion and Youth Ministry at Piper University, and before that as a visiting faculty member and teaching assistant at the Candler School of Theology and Memory. She is an ordained minister of the American Baptist Churches and has served on the ministerial staff of various churches, including Union Baptist Church in Cambridge and Victory United Church of Christ in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Join me in welcoming Dr. Wright to SMU and to Perkins.
Now, I know I have the dubious distinction of being asked to speak at the end of your long day. So I appreciate the remnant that is here, those of you who are engaging with me as we journey a little bit further into this lecture that I have called Improvising or Teaching a Better World. And it's truly my pleasure and my honor to be here with you all. I am indeed grateful to Dean Brian Stone as well as to Dean Bart Patton for their invitation and for the entire SMU faculty and staff for their hospitality. And when I received this invitation, I was both excited and a little bit daunted by the opportunity to share from my research on religious lives of Black educators and what we might learn from them for our current ministry context and for theological education. And I remember wrestling as I was deciding what I would present this week with whose voice and whose work might lend something to our current climate and who might be able to offer us a bit of hope to keep working, to keep teaching, to keep being in ministry in a world that might feel a little less hopeful than we want to right now. And so today I'm going to share primarily from my research on Dr. Anna Julia Cooper and Mrs. Septima Poinsett Clark. And both of these, shameless plug, are exemplars from my larger body of research. They're coming from this Teaching to Live book, which is on the screen. Now, as we get started though, I want to take a minute to honor the teachers who are in the room. Those of you who may at some point in your professional career been teachers and educators, but also the teachers we bring with us, those who shaped our lives. See, the reason I started this research project almost 10 years ago now, which is crazy for me to think about, is because I love teachers. I often have referred to this book and this research project as my love letter to teachers. Actual flesh and blood, humans often underpaid, overworked, and empowering entire generations. See, long before I ever imagined that I would do doctoral studies or study religion, I was a teacher. I taught math to middle schoolers and to high schoolers. I taught outside of Harvard Square at my first little school at King Open Elementary School. Very excited. Still love those kids. Many of them who are now too old, so we won't talk about that. And while, to be honest, I did not love teaching every day, I'm not going to present some romanticized version of teaching to you. There was something about the joy of being with the students when they got it, and even when they didn't. The joy of believing with them and their families in the power and possibility of transformation in spite of the layers of injustice and corruption. There was something about the ways that I felt connected to living into a legacy of embodied hope. Hope incarnate that good, radical teachers demonstrate every day. So it's from this place of centering the work of teachers, particularly Black women teachers, that I want us to enter our conversation this afternoon. Indeed, there is something to be learned, I argue, by exploring carefully and deeply the lives, the writings, and the work of teachers who themselves exemplify and embody an intersection of faith, of education, and social change. These are teachers, I say, who embody hope. There's an author, Audrey McCluskey. She calls these teachers activist educators. And part of her definition of activist educators, particularly African-American women educators of the early 20th century, was their unwavering faith in God and in themselves to do all manner of unthinkable and challenging work. McCluskey paid special attention to Black teachers and Black women school founders like Charlotte Hawkins Brown. It's a name for you to research if you've not heard it before. Or Lucy Craft Laney, or Mary McLeod Bethune, and Nanny Helen Burroughs. And she noted how these teachers and school founders who were central to any 20th century plan for communal uplift remained an often under-theorized and overlooked category of club women and social reformers. And so I've been indebted to McCluskey's idea, but also building on McCluskey's idea of these Black women activist educators having faith in God and in themselves, and I've added to her definition another trait that I've observed. I argue that these teachers, these activist educators, also have faith in their students and the children and people they were committed to teaching and working with. And what I've noted about the teachers who have inspired me over the years is how much their lives were spent with children and students in the proverbial trenches, taking risks and seeing if these risks would actually work. And I doubt that any of these teachers that have been in our lives, that we brought into in the rooms with us, ever thought that their work, their pedagogy, was going to change systems or structures. But as they continue to work, this is essentially what happened. I argue in other places that teachers often become movements. They become movements for social change. And they were improvising, I argue, using what they had and teaching a better world into existence. So Angela Cooper and Septima Clark are but two examples of this. But let's look at their lives and see what we can learn together. And for the structure of this lecture, I'm going to offer a longer description of Cooper as a teacher, and then we're going to delve into the pedagogy of Clark as a way of exploring both of them before we unpack what we might learn from them today. So let's start with Anna Julia Cooper. And I don't want us to simply look at her selected resume. By the way, her resume is impressive. And because most often when we look at any of these older figures from the 20th century, we often want to celebrate the first and the onlys. Like the fact that Anna Julia Cooper was the first, or actually one of the first, I think one of the first 4 Black women to earn a PhD. Or that she was a pioneering Black feminist thinker with her 1890s A Voice from the South. Or that she overcame tremendous obstacles, being born enslaved, and only post-emancipation getting an opportunity to go to school. and by extension to teach others, including her mother. But I want to center Cooper, the teacher, not just her resume. I want to center the one who spent most of her life teaching and advocating for access to education, particularly for Black children and Black girls. And I want us to center Cooper's reflection on teaching from an unpublished essay, or at least it was unpublished during her lifetime. And it's dated to roughly 1923. And the essay was entitled Sketches from a Teacher's Notebook. And in this essay, Cooper tells a vivid story of the Berry family. It's a family she described as socially isolated or cut off from society and education, and Cooper describes encountering these children as they sneaked onto a playground that she was supervising during World War I as the director of War Camp Community Service in West Virginia. The Berry children piqued Cooper's curiosity, partly because they never came to the playground with the rest of the children. They only came after the gates and the swings were all locked up, and they rarely spoke to anyone else. And Cooper describes this Berry family, the Berry boys, by their academic records. And some of us who have been in classrooms or teachers, we might have some stories like this. She describes that their academic records were a series of annual suspensions and expulsions, such that in any given year, they would do well to make it to October before being kicked out of school altogether. And the cycle repeated itself, with them showing up clean and ready for school in September and being kicked out by October. But Cooper describes Chan's encounter with the youngest daughter of the family, and I want to quote her at length here. She writes, "One day, when I was almost alone on the playground in consequence of a steady drizzle all forenoon, I noticed a forlorn little figure with a pair of big brown mellow eyes peeping at me through chinks in the palings. As I started down to speak to her, the frightened little creature, a child of 5 or 6, made a dash as though she would run away. And I coaxed her in, and putting her in one of those little folk swings, stood by giving her a gentle push now and then, an excitement that she enjoyed very much, though she said nothing. One could read her gratitude in those lustrous round eyes. Her joy was too deep for utterance. Alas, short-lived. A tall soldier lad in khaki puttees and an overseas cap came stalking up the walk. And without recognizing me or uttering a word, he took up a position at the rear where he caught the eye of the little mite in the swing. The effect was electrical. The child fell out of the swing as if she had been shot, and pit-a-pat, as fast as her little legs could carry, she flew, neither looking back nor waving goodbye. Startled out of my Olympian calm, I turned to the stranger and demanded to know what was the matter. Mom wants her home, he replied. Yes, but why didn't you say your mother and father sent for her? You haven't said a word. She know what I meant. Perhaps, but it isn't right for you to deal in dumb signs in conveying what you mean. You owe the child the English language. She will never be anything but a shut-in creature unless you make opportunities for her to cultivate human speech." End quote. Now, Cooper was never one to back down from a challenge, and she took this older brother to task right there on the playground for not speaking to her sister, for not introducing her to the world through language and more. And Cooper's reflections go further in this essay, Sketches from a Teacher's Notebook, on the Berry family, because she also includes her interactions with another brother, Walter, who she had attempted to teach how to weave a basket, and with their mother, because she was doing a home visit. I want to quote her reflections on this home visit again. She says, "I knocked on the floor with the point of my umbrella, and after some minutes, a comely little Black woman appeared in the doorway just opposite and stood with hands crossed in front of me, her waiting to learn what the cause was of this intrusion. Oh," I said, with an ingratiating smile, "this is Miss Berry, is it not? I'm Mrs. Cooper, Walter's teacher on the playground. I came to bring you the little basket Walter made for you. I taught him how. The lady held her pose of dignified aloofness and queenly silence. She did not frown, neither did she beam a smile. She did not ask me in, nor say that she was glad I brought the basket. She did not make a pretense of thanking me for any interest I had taken in Walter, nor did she try to act out the lie that she was glad to meet me. And yet, with it all, her manner was singularly free from active repulsion. She stood and appraised me with the same unfrowning eye I had noticed in her firstborn. Too strong to weep, too weighted down to smile. And after a while, she parted her lips, and this is what she said. I keep to myself. I don't want nothing to do with nobody. Her tone was even and clear, without the slightest suspicion of hysteria or overwrought emotion. But Mrs. Barry, I persisted, you can't live that way, end quote. Now, given Cooper's background as a linguist and a longtime teacher of classics and language and mathematics in some of the best colored schools in DC, it is possible that Cooper's primary intention in her reflections and sketches is to outline the importance of language for education and socialization. Other scholars also have noted the way that voice and voicelessness play out in Cooper's larger body of work. But for me, what Cooper conveys most fully is a picture of who she is as a teacher and an advocate for Black women and children's access to education. Cooper's description here describes her persistent, sometimes overbearing way of seeking out and trying to convince this family of the importance of education and language and the related abilities to engage with the wider community and world. In truth, here we get a brief glance at Cooper's educational philosophy and her belief that the purpose of education was to connect people, to give them access to a world that for generations they had been cut off from. More than her earlier writings, by the way, with their sometimes problematic appeals to Victorian notions of womanhood, this essay helps us to see some of the evolution of Anna Julia Cooper's writing in the heart of Cooper's activist zeal. She was committed to empowering children, poor children, women, and Black people, and yet here we also see in this essay that it was only after leaving the war camp position did Cooper learn why this family had been cut off, why they had become isolated from their community. She learned that their father had been lynched, and their mother, in an attempt to protect herself and her children, had withdrawn from the community. Cooper writes, it was not till I had left West Virginia that I understood the tragedy of Mrs. Barry's grim struggle with life. Her husband, an innocent man, had been torn from her arms by an infuriated mob and brutally murdered, lynched. The town realized its mistakes afterwards, but it was too late to bind up that broken family, and the humble drama of that obscure Black woman like a wounded animal with her cubs literally digging herself in and then at bay dumbly turning to face America, her head bloody but unbowed. I swear, the pathos and inexplorable faithfulness of this titanic struggle and inescapable one in the clash of American forces is worthy and epic for its heroic grandeur and uncomparable grit. Cooper ends her essay, Sketches from a Teacher's Notebook, with a question that she leaves unanswered, trying to make sense of what a typical school might do for such a family. Her question is, she wondered what our brand of education, what our smug injunction that home is expected to cooperate with the school will find or create for the help and guidance of such a home. Cooper wondered, too, whether isolation was really the answer and whether that was going to solve the family's problems, but she empathized with this mother and so many mothers in making this choice. Cooper aptly saw this family and this mother's dilemma as a peculiarly American one, not a unique one, but a peculiarly American one, noting the ways that the systems and generations of racism and oppression had created the complexity of this mother's situation, and the tragedy as well as the attempt to isolate oneself in order to avoid further trouble and pain. So from this essay, we see a snapshot of the ways that Cooper enacted a radical pedagogy inspired by her faith in God and in this community in trying to connect with this mother and these children. She initially thought, like many young teachers, that she knew best and that she could help them. But she learned that she needed to respect this mother's position. And she articulates the complicated relationships that Black women and children have had with even the most well-intentioned school systems and communal structures. But before we unpack more about Julia Cooper and what she embodies and teaches us, I want us to look at another story, that of Septima Clark. Now, Clark was born decades after Cooper in 1898, 30 years actually, after Cooper in Charleston, South Carolina. And while she is born free, the world of racial discrimination and Jim Crow segregation that she encounters make for more parallels in her early life with Cooper's than the three decades separating them might otherwise suggest. And as we did with Cooper, I wanted to reflect a little bit on some of the written records of Clark and who she was as a teacher. In a tract and a newsletter, if this is the right one, we'll go a couple different places. Here we go. This one. Actually, I gotta go back. Sorry. There we go. We'll start here. In a tract or newsletter from the Citizenship Education program, Clark wrote this couplet, and it states simply, "I'm a Negro, born Black in a white man's land. My name is Septima Clark. I'm a teacher, and I've spent nearly all my adult life teaching citizenship to children who really aren't citizens." Clark's words here are powerful, and they're found in a newsletter that would have been mailed to people who were supporting them or who were using some of their curriculum through the Tennessee Highlander School and through the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But they also, for me, are helpful synopsis of the tensions and struggles of the work of many African American educators and activists. Clark's words push us to wrestle with the realities of the extremely slow process of working for societal change, as in she committed her entire life to this work, not just a weekend or a season or a couple of months. Her words are also a reminder of the tremendous faith, commitment, and effort needed to keep working, even when she knew that the basic skills and rights that she was pushing for were in direct opposition to what the dominant society desired for her or for her children, her students, and the families and the community that she was invested in. Septima Clark's work in pedagogy during the civil rights movement and beyond are significant parts of this larger discourse that I've been researching and wrestling with, that wrestles with the ways that religion and education intersect to support social change. And her narrative for me also includes examples that we don't talk about a lot of the complicated role that religion played and continues to play in this country. For example, her work is another reminder that religion and education do not always or even primarily function in positive or transformative ways. Her pedagogy includes ways that Clark and others were able to respond, though, to the unexpected challenges of educating children and adults who had been systematically kept from education and disenfranchised from the typical venues for advancement in the United States. And by extension, these educators were able to transform their communities and American democracy. Mind you, I want you to be clear that Clark's work was teaching literacy. But in this couplet, she never says, "I spent my entire life teaching children to read." She says, "I taught them citizenship." And we'll pay attention to that. So she's thinking about citizenship. Now, also, interestingly enough, 2013, having my students read a blog entitled Top 10 Reasons Septima Clark Was a Bad A Teacher. And beyond the shock value of using a word or seeing a word like that in a div school classroom, many of my students were curious with me as to why I started with Septima Clark. And they were curious with me because they wanted to know why I was starting with this lesser known, if not completely unknown figure from the 1950s civil rights era. Because most of my students, like most of your students here, or most of you when you were students here, sign up for classes because they are interested in some big name philosopher or big name pastor or someone who's going to teach them how to transform the world. So my students had come to this class because they wanted to learn about Paulo Freire, they'd come because they wanted to know about Saul Alinsky, or maybe even bell hooks. They did not sign up for Septima Clark. They know who she was. They wanted to know why I was wasting their time. Because Septima Clark, for them, was not a key figure. And even during the civil rights movement, she didn't often make the headlines. She's what I often call like an unlikely radical, or like under the radar radical. And at least that was how she was perceived initially, and how my students viewed her initially years later. And what I want to remind us though is that Clark, probably at the height of the civil rights movement, Clark could have already been considered a senior citizen. And we know that radical educators don't just emerge at 55 or 60. She had been doing this radical work for a long time, for over 40 years, as she was teaching initially on Johns Island outside of Charleston, and then in the segregated schools in Charleston City. And before, she got fired from Charleston Public Schools for refusing to conceal her NAACP membership in 1956. And historian Catherine Sharon writes that this firing inadvertently freed Clark to devote her work to this teaching of citizenship, to confronting issues facing Southern Black communities. So it's in the mid-1950s that Clark, after already spending 40 years working in rural segregated schools and then fighting to teach in the city's segregated schools, because that's the other thing that often my students forget or don't understand or don't have context for, is that even segregated schools in the South often had white teachers. And so in the city of Charleston, all Black schools still could only have white teachers. When you think about what was the project there. But it's only then that she's able to perfect her pedagogy that I want us to begin to look at. So let's talk about Clark's pedagogy. And so part of my work has been to try to go through many of the things that she's done to get us a little bit of a system here. And I argue that there are three things, and I see this in Cooper, I see this in Clark, I see it in a couple other folks. But there's three things about her pedagogy, and I want us to walk through each of them. That it's pragmatic, that it's improvisational, and that it is communal. Now, of course, I've been amazed by her pedagogy or her teaching strategy, both because of its simplicity as well as in its effectiveness, but I've also been shamed because generations later it seems that we still haven't figured out how to implement many of the strategies that she gave us years ago, okay? So let's begin to look at these. So in a word, Clark's educational agenda with both children and adults was pragmatic. Clark's experiences in the rural Jim Crow South allowed her to help to see that many adults and youth lack the basic skills such as the confidence to fully participate in society. Because often, I remember when she first started working with the Highlander Project, Tennessee Highlander School, they were like, let's just go register people to vote. And Clark was like, we can't register people to vote if they don't know how to read. So we can't get them to read if they don't have confidence to go and engage. And so one of the things that you'll see here is that when she thought about reading, both to her early students and then also to her adults, is that she had to come up with strategies of writing, often on dry cleaner bags. Now remember, you gotta also, we're aged, like you gotta put yourself, not the plastic ones. There was a time where those paper dry cleaner bags, because she did not have chalkboards or smart boards like we have, or we take it, for granted now. But she would then bring those back to Johns Island with her, and she would also translate many of the stories that the students would tell her using their gullah-inflected language to figure out how to to write the words or how to spell it so that they understood and then translate to what they would see when they actually got standard English language. But she also moved forward, teaching different ways. Like, this talks about her having to write a duh instead of a the, and even having to start and teach in this way all the time. But one of the things also about it being practical and pragmatic is that she then moved from these basic strategies that she had with children to remembering that with the adults actually needed to learn the basic literacy, but instead of having primers like See, Dick, Run, or See, Jane, Run, or those Spot and Jane books, she was like, we're going to use the voter registration documents, and we're going to use the literacy test, and we're going to use bank vouchers and checks and tax bills, to name a few, as the curriculum and the activity sheets, because she was also teaching civics, an overview of what it meant to be a citizen, of how governments were structured, how legislation was passed, and how elected officials affected the day-to-day outcomes of the lives of individuals and communities, and how they should be held accountable. Clark was teaching people what they needed to know to survive and thrive in their current context. One of the questions that I often ask my students nowadays, though, when we explore Clark's work, is whether or not we have consensus on the types of practical skills that people need to navigate the U.S. society today. And who's teaching those skills? And is there something at stake in even keeping communities in disagreement regarding what is required to fully participate in our society? The next part of this, though, second part of her pedagogy, is that it's improvisational. A second aspect that I love is improvisational. And improvisational pedagogy, by the way, is not meant as a pejorative description, and neither is it one that I impose superficially. It's a word that Clark used to describe herself. For example, in one of her lecture notes from a lecture she gave at Howard University in 1974, Clark offered a comparative study of education among whites and blacks in South Carolina, and she writes in one word that prior to the 1954 decision, black teachers simply had to improvise. And Clark goes on to outline the different supplies that black teachers had, or the limited resources and no equipment that they had, versus the extensive libraries that were often part and parcel in that separate but equal setup. And she also talks about the fact that even when there was a book rental program, many parents couldn't afford to rent the textbooks, and so the teachers had to improvise. But she also talks about the many ways that what we are seeing in this improvisational nature is that she is describing a skill set that she had, but that many black teachers also had. So when you say something is improvisational, it's also not saying that it is off the cuff, or without training, or without careful skill. If we recognize, for example, parallels with quilt making or improvisational cooking or with jazz or other art forms, most of the time, in order for you to get to a place of being able to improvise well, you have to be highly skilled. You don't get to improvise on something until you've learned often the basics of things. You cannot improvise and scat and play over different notes and do different quadrilles until you have learned the basics. So to say that a pedagogical strategy is improvisational is to recognize the high level of skill that is being employed here, but also the riskiness that is being employed here. For example, when one improvises, one is doing something that no one has done before. One is taking the risk without having all the data for us to make our good data-driven decision making that we love nowadays, and saying, I'm going to try something, I'm going to see if it works. And we're going to hold it lightly enough to say that if it does work, okay, we'll do it. But if it doesn't work, we're going to pivot and try something else. And so It's interesting because unlike most top-down educational reform or generic philosophies of transformation, improvisational pedagogy is flexible, but it's also open to risk. And improvisation also includes the willingness and ability to create using whatever is available. We don't have the best resources, improvise. We don't have as much money, improvise. We may only have scraps, improvise. Which is, by the way, also I love this quilt here. It's from a art museum in San Diego, I think. And it's one where it's clearly an improvisational quilt pattern where they took basically the scraps, and you'll see some of this also in, like, say, the G's Benz quilters, where they will have things where they make art out of very small remnants. And there's a philosophy often in improvisational quilting and artwork and even pedagogy that nothing, you want to leave nothing unused. Yeah. So there's no such thing as a scrap, but you turn it into something that is then going to be useful, not just for beautification, but also for keeping your family warm. So Clark's pedagogy and early teaching experience was no exception to the principle and skill set of improvisation, but also Clark had to constantly figure out how to educate adult learners and to develop resources specific to their context, to their needs, and yes, to their dreams. So if they're dreaming about how to make a new dress, I'm going to teach you how to read, and I'm going to teach you math using sewing patterns. If you're dreaming about owning your own home, I'm going to teach you how to read your tax bill so that you can have access to that, no one can steal your land. But the idea of capitalizing on what was already available also meant that they had to take the time to cultivate the human resources or the people power. And Clark was also doing what we would also say of doing this communal pedagogy or developing leadership among common folk, employing them first as teachers and then as a cadre of organic local leaders and change agents. So connected with this attentiveness required for improvisational pedagogy is the necessity and joy of connecting with actual people. Clark and her fellow teachers are credited, by the way, with having higher success rates in rural South Carolina than literacy programs with proven national track records because they valued and respected the dignity of the people. And so, for example, Clark championed participatory pedagogy by designing lessons which took seriously the desires of her students, but she also never employed teachers who would look down on her students. Often, she didn't use actual public school teachers in this Citizenship Education program. She used beauticians, and she used bus drivers, and she used store owners who people were coming in contact with on a regular basis, but who were not necessarily part of what would have been called the Black middle class or elite. But she's also doing some of this amazing stuff of what Bell Hooks later calls education as a practice of freedom. And I also love what she does in terms of building this community because Clark is credited with saying, I believe unconditionally in the ability of people to respond when they are told the truth. And I remember, by the way, every time I share that quote or share anything from Clark with my seminary students, because we teach everyone to engage, critique, go back and forth. And they always would go back and forth saying, wait a minute, she said she believes unconditionally and the ability of people to respond when they are told the truth, but I'm not sure I agree with that statement. I'm not sure that statement is right. And they would always come up with a host of scenarios to present why the statement could be false or why or how people are not always ready to respond or not always ready to act or not always ready to lead when they are told the truth. And I remember smiling simply with my students, partly because in essence, they had missed the point. The point for me and possibly for Clark was not that the people were going to always get it right. The point was not that the people were always going to be able to change the world immediately or even that they were going to engage in the world around them exactly as I would envision or Clark would have envisioned or those of us who think we know best would envision. But Clark's point was simply that she believed in them. Her starting place, this communal dimension, was that of hope and trust, such that the work she was engaging in and the responsibility she she was entrusting to the students in her care, she actually held out hope that they could accomplish it. Nothing motivates people more than your actual high expectations that they can achieve what you challenge them to do. So Clark's educational philosophy was built upon a profound trust or belief in all persons' capacity to learn and to change and to participate fully in their own lives. And I want to quote here from one of her biographies, where she says, "I've seen growth like most people don't think is possible. I can even work with my enemies because I know from experience that they might have a change of heart any minute. Sometimes my own growth embarrasses me. I don't like to admit it, even to myself, that I once was so ill at ease with white people or so middle class in my attitudes that I had a hard time teaching poor people. But I overcame those things. It took 40 years." Clark applied this perspective on growth to her students, children and their adults, to leaders, political and community leaders, and to herself. One of the most astounding things, and I don't write about it often, but Clark was still working with Strom Thurmond. Like, she was like, there's never a permanent enemy and there's never a permanent ally. She's like, this is our state representative, this is our senator, and guess what? We're gonna ask of him and require of him things that we require of all our elected officials. And whether or not it was naive, for Clark, this faith in people is what enabled her to work with so many. And she never presumed that people were unworthy, by the way, of an education, or too uninformed, or too rigid, or too racist to work on improving the world around them. This faith in people and in their capacity to grow and change was part and parcel, though, of her Christian faith. Her understanding of the transformative power of love and her sense of being called by God to work for change despite the potential backlash. And so it's deeply connected with her improvisational pedagogy, and her genuine love and valuing of the people is at the core her faith in God and her faith in people. And interestingly enough, a lot of people will write about Clark's pedagogy, or they'll write about some of her work in the civil rights, but they don't know what to do with her religion. I remember the first time I went to Charleston to kind of view her archives, I met this young man in the archives, and he was like, yeah, she's interesting, but you gotta wade through her religion. And I was like, say less, that's why I'm here. But interestingly enough for me, the things that are there, besides her biographies, her autobiography, she writes lots of things. And she also has lots of different sources that I was combing through. And one of them was this article called Citizenship and the Gospel. And there Clark makes a direct connection between the first words of Jesus, his public ministry in Luke 4:18, where Jesus announces, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, sent me to heal the brokenhearted and to preach deliverance to the captives and recovery of the sight to the blind, so set at liberty them that are oppressed." And she connects this to the work of justice she undertook in the 1950s. And she pointedly argues that where there is obedience to the gospel, there will be concern for the less fortunate. For Clark, there was no separating her understanding of herself as a Christian from justice work. And so Clark was very quick to critique any efforts of pastors or leaders who did not see this connection. She wrote, quote, "Missionaries cannot be content preaching the gospel to hungry folk." She also pushed beyond the concern for their just physical needs, and she also noted the connection between reforming corrupt governments and systems as part of Jesus' ministry. She says, if we are really to contribute to the deliverance of the captives, it is necessary to do something to redeem the system which keeps people in captivity. Clark was espousing what we might later call a theology of liberation that was deeply rooted in her personal faith and in her work for social change. Clark's faith was not a naive one, though. And it was not one that required a love ethic blindly without recognizing that the cost of such faith often cost a lot. And of course, there's sexism and gender stuff, so Clark often would defer to male clergy leadership, but she would also stand up. Clark the complex emotional struggles that some of the participants, for example, in the citizenship education trainings were experiencing. I want to make sure I'm getting to the right quote here. Let's go back. Actually here, yep. I'm going the wrong direction. This is what I do. Alrighty, I'll stop here for a second without the quote, but I'll read it to you here because I don't think I have it in this slide. Clark recounts a time when Andrew Young and Dorothy Cotton, who are leading a workshop, and she tells them, you gotta open your eyes. And literally, open your eyes. Not a metaphorical thing, but you gotta open your eyes. Because part of the citizenship education program was this heavy emphasis on singing and praying and gathering people together. And so they were praying and singing a song, and they were singing something about gonna love my neighbors and treat everybody right. And she's right, she says, I saw this woman this young woman who was really struggling, and her face was so distorted, and I wondered what was wrong with her. And she'd just come from Koinonia, down in Georgia. And the policemen had arrested her at Koinonia. And when they arrested her, they had put her on a square, they called her a mulatto, and they wanted to make her ashamed, and they put cattle prods to her heels to see if she could jump up and down, and so she couldn't sing. I love everybody. She said, I just can't sing that. So I had to call attention to Andy and Dorothy, and I said, you gotta open your eyes and see what's happening to this young woman. She can't sing that song. She can't love everybody when people have treated her so mean. And she just came from there to this workshop. And so we had some words. And Andy told me that I must have been a saint. And I said, well, there are lots of saints. I don't know who you're talking about, but I want to keep your eyes open about you and see what's happening, because don't expect this young woman to sing that until she can feel more comfortable. And see, Clark understood that love and nonviolence as a strategy was not something that one just gave lip service to. And it was not something that was easily undertaken. And so Clark knew that she had come to that work from her understanding of who she was as a Christian, but that she also had to create space for people to deal with the realities that they were confronting, as well as their trust in God. So in Clark we find complicated, interesting connections between her pedagogy and her faith in God. Also in other places where she talks about what her philosophy for the civil rights movement was, she writes something that says, Peter said, I must obey God. And this is the philosophical basis of the movement. No obedience without representation. Wherever there are people who have no right to make laws, why should we obey them? When we petty lawmakers are gone, God lives on. The world is marveling at the courage of Black people who have nothing in their hand but the law of God as they face dogs and water hoses. When you come to the end of your life journey, you won't have to answer to any city judge or any board of education or any Supreme Court. You will only have to answer to God. And God is going to say, well done. Have faith in God, though. The sun will shine. Have faith in God. Interestingly enough, by the way, I found pieces of these philosophies on note cards and index cards in her archives. And so we don't have the full context of some of her comments. But the stylistic markers from this particular one possibly speak to an oral presentation, testimony, or sermon that crescendos to celebration in the end. But what we see as evident in the comments is her understanding about God as the ultimate authority, higher and more significant than any human authority. Interestingly enough, Clark and Cooper also both put their love of people and students front and center in their work, even when it cost them personally. Clark, for the most part, is creating and crafting a folk education, an education built with and for common folks. And she's doing stuff that even others like Cooper early on was teaching classics to mostly middle class and aspirational African Americans to go to colleges. Clark is saying, even if they don't ever go to college, I want people to live well. And so interestingly enough, what I see in both of them, looking back at Anna Julia Cooper's understanding of religion and social change and looking at Clark's work for citizenship education, is that they both are beginning to outline what they see as Christianity supporting egalitarian teachings from Jesus or this work for justice. And we see this in many ways that, for example, Cooper and Clark in their theological positions, they seek to live in ways that not only teach people these theological truths, but that also embody these connections between their faith and their justice work. For example, at Cooper's 100th birthday, by the way, I love when people get to live full, long, rich lives. And so on the celebration of her 100th birthday, Cooper says, quote, it isn't what we say about ourselves that matters, it's what our lives stand for. SMU faculty and womanist theologian Karen Baker Fletcher also expands upon this, and she says Cooper's life stood for unfailing, persevering commitment to Christian service and hope in God of freedom and equality. Service was public and required participation in God's activity of reform. It required social gospel theology and ethics. It required the application of biblical principles to a holistic analysis of racism, sexism, and classism. Cooper's contributions and Clark's contributions to their communities were manifold. Their lives were marked by an intriguing combination of struggle and hope, but also an optimism that's grounded in their belief in both the power of people, but also the power of God. And interestingly enough, as I reflect on them, and as hopefully we reflect on them together, Cooper's life is an invitation. Clark's life is also an invitation. Their lives are inviting us to reimagine how we might continue in their legacy and transform what it means to be this type of activist educator, activist minister into the future. Their lives are inviting us to imagine anew what our contributions might be as we take up the mantle to embody the complex and messy connections between religion and education and social transformation in a new generation, with new children and new people who could be experiencing voicelessness and social isolation in innumerable ways. And indeed, Cooper and Clark's stories invite us, though, to remember anew the improvisational and revolutionary nature of education, and specifically theological education. And I remember Bell Hooks writes and describes her early experiences of teaching and learning and reflects on the legacy of many of these activist educators in the Black community when she writes, indeed, my all-Black grade school became the location where I experienced learning as revolution. For me, it still is not lost that this idea of learning as revolution is something I never heard of until I got way past the age of when I had like compulsory education, only as I was getting into specialized education. But the idea of learning as revolution is at the center of the lives of activist educators, but it also keeps us wondering, or keeps me wondering, what would it look like for our children to experience education as revolutionary, as a practice of freedom in both public schools and in religious educational settings? What would it look like for every teacher to see their work as a sacred calling and education as the practice of liberation and freedom? What would it look like for congregations and religious communities to commit to the education and social needs of children and families as an integrated part of their spiritual development and wholeness? And what would it mean for us to understand a wider and more expansive vision of the sacred task of theological education, of transformation that goes beyond learning facts to educating for wholeness and flourishing for all? Thank you.
Dr. Wright, thank you so much for that presentation. Let's give her another round of applause. Very to reclaim the lives of these powerful Black women activist educators. And your in-depth study and research is elucidating. It really helps us reclaim this legacy that is so inspiring and empowering to all of us, but particularly those of us who are Black women scholars. And I have a question, it's a two-point question. The first part of the question is, in your book, Teaching to Live, your analysis of these variety of scholar, activist, educator, Black women, helped us, as you state, to expand our understandings of the intersections among education, religion, and revolutionary movements for social reform, looking at their case studies. And you indicate that it's difficult to categorize the diversity of the models represented by these case studies. Yet, do you see in today's revolutionary movements, particularly among young leaders, characteristics of these formative, these wonderful and empowering Black women activist educators? And secondly, you mention in your book the scholarship of Gayrod Wilmore, right? And his powerful analysis connecting the tradition of Black radicalism in the Black church. And even he acknowledges the fact that the Black church has somewhat of a mixed record in this regard. And you were mentioning that toward the end of your talk. What are some ways that the Black church can either improve upon this record or continue the ongoing efforts to juxtapose education, religion, and social reform, particularly in a time such as this?
Thank you, by the way, for those questions. And I will probably not do any of them justice. And if I forget pieces of them, bring it back to me. So we'll start at the end. I love Gayrod Wilmore, and I remember when I was first thinking about this research project, I was going to do the educational equivalent of what I thought he had done in his documentary history and Black religion, Black radicalism, because I was like, this is it. Because he was coming to it as a historian, a church historian, and really trying to reclaim what he calls this radical strand of Black Christianity. And he had a metaphor of a river or a stream that it ebbed and flowed through the history of Black Christianity. And so I was like, I'm gonna write about the ebb and flow of radicalism through Black education traditions. And interestingly enough, by the way, some of you may know that most of my earlier research was not on teachers. I moved to teachers in this book, but I started researching youth and young adults. And so the reason in some ways I wanted to research teachers and how we teach people to be part of a social change movement is because a lot of the young adults, in terms of their spirituality that I was working with, the way they enter spirituality or the places where their spiritual passions came alive was in their activism and not necessarily in Sunday school. Because they won't end Sunday school, that's the whole truth. But just to really think through some of that. So a lot of the impetus for me, or one of the questions I had, was really, how did we train generations of folks who held their spirituality, their activism together? So that was so that was really a question that was coming up. And so in many ways, what I see in these profiles of activist educators are 8 different ways that they are holding together spirituality, some interconnection or understanding of education, and social transformation. And I do 8 partly because I ended up needing to just do 8, because there could have been 28, there could have been 58. But there's also a way that I had to do no less than 8, because this is a complicated piece of history. And I'm trying to also walk us through a lot of different moments in the 20th century. And then also a way that I'm trying to give, if there's a curious young adult in my community, because also my love language is books. I'm like, here, you want to know something? Let me give you a book. We got a question? Let me write you a book. And so one of the things that I want to be able to offer some of the young activists that we've been thinking about is really a way of saying, you're not alone in this work. There were generations before you who were also wrestling with these same questions, or were wrestling, if not the same questions, with similar tensions between, like, can you be Christian and Black? Or can you be Christian and work for justice? Or can you be whatever it might be? Like, because I grew up in this faith tradition, or I grew up with this different thing. And so trying to offer them profiles or examples of folks who did it. And not to say that you should do, like, because that's the whole idea. Not that you should do it like any one of them, but hopefully that when you see so many different models, you recognize that there is a way to walk in this path. For you to begin to say, I can learn from them and then take this and do it my way. And so that's, I guess, in terms of like even the question around like, where can churches walk alongside of this? I often think, and I say this in another book, that churches often have a PR problem. And what I mean is, we've got a rich heritage. Most of us in this room recognize that we're standing on the shoulders of folks who have walked a path that has helped us to live transformed lives. And we don't tell nobody about it. Or we let those who are talking about it talk about it in such a way that it becomes a list of do this, don't do that. And no young adult wants to be part of like a list of casuistry of like these are the list of things you cannot do, and we come here for all your fun to die. But what would it mean for churches to amplify the complicated stories of our change agents, or our sometimes martyrs, sometimes saints, who have helped to say, alrighty, there's an issue. Out of my deep-seated love for God, I work for this or for, like, along this path, or even out of my deep-seated desire or understanding that things can be better, like, I work for this. And so churches often have these rich intergenerational opportunities to expand and to help people, but I don't know that we take full advantage of it. And I mean, that's Black, white, Latino, like that's church. But I think that's one of the things that I hope for, is that, like, is there a way for us to reclaim both what it means to be Christian and what it means to be an activist, and to not see those things as like mutually exclusive categories, or what it means to be Christian, what it means to be an educator, and not to see, again, these things as mutually exclusive categories or like problematic. Because there's always been a tension. There's not a consistent through line that says they're always positively connected. No, that's a lie. But they're also not always at war. And so how we hold those things together and tell a richer story, I think, is what we also need to work on.
One more question before we go to Q&A. You focus on 8 scholar activists, and you indicate even in your introduction that these are well-known Black women scholar activists. But what makes your book unique, your book Teaching to Live, and this is a plug for your book, is that you were able to engage in and utilize an effective research methodology by combing through unexamined archives and resources in order to move deeper into their stories and their pedagogies. And we had a sense of that in your talk today. Could you tell us a little bit about your process in research?
So, when we were first getting together to talk about what I was going to present here, one of the things I also just said to Dr. Lewis, I'm like, I'm an amateur sleuth. And so I love just like going down rabbit holes, and that's one of the things that you do in like archival research is that you often don't know what you're looking for until you jump down the hole, and then you're just like, let's go, let's keep following it. But I also I'm a practical theologian, not a historian, so the way that I enter the archives, I often come with different questions than maybe even a historian would come with. And so I'm going to see and sometimes analyze different things, but I'm also bringing all of the wisdom and maybe naivete of underrepresented community, because it means that I'm looking at different things. So for example, methodologically, if you've ever been through archives, you recognize that archivists and research librarians do amazing work in creating finding aids that tell you what they think is important in these documents. And then there are often files of miscellaneous. Or even in those archive boxes, it may say these are Septima Clark's speeches. And inside Septima Clark's speeches are also, my favorites, index cards that are written, or speech notes that also might be on the back of recipe things, or on the side of AME Sunday school primers, or on the side of napkins, or on the sides of other random things that you could just never imagine. And so part of the methodology is to take seriously those notes that fit into the dominant category, like these are speech notes, but also those notes that says she has a Sunday school primer, and we're going to learn something about her interior, personal, spiritual life by reading what she puts in the margins of her Sunday school book. Because if you've read a Sunday school book, or if you've had to prepare to teach, we normally have our commentary, we highlight it, we put our notes in there, we put question marks when we think that the commentary writer didn't get it right, or we put something over here that tells us where we go cross-reference it to, and that's what's also in her archives. And so I'm there piecing stuff together that say, this is giving us a glimpse of what was important to her. This is giving us a glimpse of the fact that on this day, in 1950-something, she decided that it was important in this, AME Sunday school. And by the way, she was not AME, she worshiped around, so it's also interesting to me to see whose Sunday school, like literature she was reading, and who she was reading, and also which places she was speaking, because there's all of that. There's also a genuine sense of ecumenism in her life. But these are the kinds of things that I'm able to look at. But it also requires us to, particularly when we're handling the archives of Black women, to look beyond the dominant community's categories of what counts. So I couldn't just look at public address, or I couldn't just look at published things. I had to look at, like, for example, in the case of like what I read about Ida B. Wells, the richest thing is not her public-facing autobiography, but it was her Memphis diaries. And like it's in her diaries that we get a sense of her struggles, her passions, what she wanted to do, her life as a Sunday school teacher. I was like, who in this room knew that Ida B. Wells was a Sunday school teacher? We got one, because you had a good seminary professor. But that's the kind of stuff that often it's not highlighted, even if you have a whole life that says this woman is an activist, a change agent, but also she taught, and by the way, she taught primarily men's Sunday school classes. Because they were segregated by gender. Young men, so that's who she was teaching. And all of that, by the way, going through different sources to say, this is what's important. Yeah, that's been part of the process. And also the joy of it, because again, you have to be open and do kind of a grounded theoretical method as well, because you cannot go in and say, this is what I'm going to find. You go in and you're like, okay, I'm going to be transformed by what I find.
Last statement I want to make before we get to Q&A. I'm so struck by your incorporation of the model of improvisation of these activist educators, and it is so foundational to the African American experience, I think, and the African American brilliance, our ability, as you stated so succinctly, that knowing the subject so well leads to the ability of improvisation.
and so improv, again, I didn't impose that word, but when I saw it, and again, these notes from a lecture she gave at Howard University, I was like, yes, that's exactly what this woman is having to do. That's exactly what this community is having to do. And I think it's also something, and I do couch it or try to put it into a larger tradition. Both, and this is not to discount the amazing stuff that Clark is doing individually, but I want us to remember that we can tell Clark's story because we have Clark's papers. But there are lots of other Clarks whose stories we cannot tell who are part of this larger tradition because we don't have access to their papers. And so, or they didn't have the wisdom to save those things for us. Somebody's grandbaby cleaned up the house and got rid of it. And I was like, Clark was like, no, I'm gonna get this. And similarly, so with this larger, I guess, category of improvisation within African American communities, it is really trying to honor the ways that lots of different people groups are able to take things that are like maybe even indigenous to their community, but also use them in different ways, or may not be indigenous to their community, but use them in different ways. And I think also, yes, jazz, cooking, crafting, but there are also, I think, new forms of improv that we gotta celebrate with this new generation where you're like, wait a minute, because we don't often, we want to talk about jazz and things that now have become like mainstreamly acceptable, but hip hop is improvisation. There's improvisation in terms of like different art forms, or improvisation in different like spoken word communities that I've been able to work with younger people because they're still in this tradition of saying, all right, so we will see your poetic verse and put it over a two-dope beat. And what does it mean for us to then create something new out of these two genres and improv them? So it's a large, rich tradition.
You might have said this and I just went over my head, but what I'm thinking when you talk about all the different types of improv dance, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of, she's a dancing teacher.
She is. And actually, no, I don't know that I specifically put dance in there, but yes, there are lots of improvisational dance traditions. And there's another one actually, now I'm blanking on it. There was a young woman who was introduced to me who does modern dance, and her choreographed pieces are also using the quilts of her like family. If it comes to me, it'll probably be on the plane back to Connecticut. But when it comes to me, I'd love to share this because it's another one of these contemporary examples. Mm-hmm.
Hi.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thank you. I'm sitting here, I'm weepy right now, just because everything you shared is pretty much my life. I appreciate the digging in with the heritage. And so I was blessed about 5 years ago to start up a Legacy Keepers entity that honors the Black and Mexican heritage of Old East McKinney. And I'm doing the very thing that you're describing. And so those ladies that you highlighted reminded me of my Sunday school teacher who just passed away. And she, I named, her husband has a school named after him. They were like very prominent people in the community. They were change agents. And after the time period when teachers had to start having their credentials and have their certifications, it moved a lot of people out of the way because they just didn't want to do it, especially the older ones. They didn't want to do that. And so I named her Porch Ministries, the June McGowan from Porch Ministries, because she could do more with a church van and a front porch teaching with children than she probably would have ever done in the traditional classroom. And so what I'm wondering is, how do you, or have you had opportunity to take those types of stories to to persons who are like legislators and to sit with them and to just to give them, it's not a way to say that what happened with a traditional, with what is called traditional classroom is not warranted, but that there's honor in diversity, there's honor in equitable build, there's honor in inclusion, because because culture is not to make us stand apart, it's to highlight what God has placed within us. And if we're going to be a Christian nation, we have to be a welcoming nation of all. And so I don't know if you've been in spaces where you've had that opportunity or not.
So a couple of different things that you brought up when I was listening to your question, and thank you also for your work in highlighting her porch ministry. I love that concept. Same time, I think, or maybe a couple months before my book came out in 2024, Jarvis Gibbons, education scholar, historian at Harvard, did a book primarily about Carter G. Woodson, but not really, on fugitive pedagogy. And it also sounds like what you're describing is a type of fugitive pedagogy. And fugitivity, or the fugitive pedagogy idea, is also a reminder, and similar to some of the ways that Clark is flying under the radar, but it also is a way that sometimes teachers in formal spaces and in informal spaces are able to do this type of work for social change and transformation that will never be state sanctioned. And so there's something in what you said that is like, how do you go to a legislator and say, support this? And part of me is like, but do you want to? And what I mean by that is, I think there is something strategic about us holding to the spaces where you can have what's the language I'm looking for, the public facing conversations and the public talk. And then there's also a space where you do need to have the internal talk, where there's strategies that have to be used for revolutionary change are probably not the ones that I'm going to put in the New York Times op-ed piece. And that's not me being cheeky, but it's like we have this, they always talk about, even in the theory of the routinization of charisma, the one way, how do you routinize a radical? You give them a job. How do you give, transform something that could have been revolutionary? You make it mainstream. You give it to everybody and tell them, you mandate it, and now SLOs that go with it. And now there are other things that so something that started as transformative has now become the thing that we are going to test everything out of. And so I think there is something to be said about us doing this both and work. I honor what's happening in formal educational spaces. We need all of it. But I also honor what's happening in informal educational spaces, because we need that as well. And how do we happily, put it this way, I'm also a pragmatist in the sense that in the world as it is, we need both. Now, if I'm doing aspirational stuff and in my dreams of the world as it should be, we maybe only need one. But in the world as it is, we still need both. And so I also think, again, thinking about what churches can do, one of the strategies of African American churches for the longest time had been to be that alternative to formalized education. So what does it mean if there's no music education in schools, or if there's no Black history in schools, or Latino history in schools? Are there ways that other community entities like churches or arts education, can we still provide space and resources to do that work? And I want to hopefully say yes. Because we need that kind of stuff. Because even in the pandemic, I remember having conversations with the Massachusetts Council of Churches, really trying to get them to think through, all of your churches have these big empty buildings right now. What can you do to support your people and your congregations? And many of them had simple strategies like, we're going to offer our Wi-Fi passwords so that people who live in the community near access to the other public spaces that they would normally have it, they now have access to this.
Any other questions?
Hi, I just have a comment. I have a 25-year-old granddaughter who I can't necessarily get her to go to church with me, but when our church traveled to Tulsa for Black Wall Street, two of my granddaughters came with me, and I was amazed at how many notes that they took on what they learned. So that'll be how I will get them acclimated to our history by taking them on trips like that. And maybe I'll get them to come to church, maybe. But I just wanted to share that I have a personal experience with taking another route for getting children to church.
And also for us to see that that also is church work. Like, taking that trip to Black Wall Street was a spiritual pilgrimage, and they needed that. Thank you for sharing.
I'll share something.
I was on a United Women in Faith learning Zoom, and I shared that with my granddaughter, 10 years old, that I read books about Black women. And one of the women said, why don't we create a collection of books, United Women in Faith, collection of books with stories for grandmothers reading to granddaughters. And this woman told me the other day she applied for a grant with United Women of Faith and got it. And it's starting these books at each church, and you can pass it around, and it's going to be all women, which I understand, but for me, it was about Black women. I can do it, but this woman knows how to put suggestions into action.
And that's
Yes.
one of the gifts of congregations and organizations, that typically we often now are living so siloed that we think that we've got to have all of it in ourselves. Instead of us saying, all right, at coffee hour, we're going to talk about the fact that I got this idea, and someone else may have resources, and someone else may have time, and someone else may have something else that will often get the work done. So that's good. I'm glad that you guys are able to work together to pull it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wright and Dr. Lewis, for this wonderful time. Yes, let's thank them. What an insightful time of engagement this afternoon. Well, my name is Kaylee Vita. I am the Associate Director of Lifelong Learning for the Office of External Programs. I want to thank you again for coming today to the Perkins Fall Convocation. Hasn't it been such a wonderful day today? Yes, wonderful lectures today. I don't know about all of you, but my mind is full of everything that I've learned today, so I know I will definitely be ruminating on this for a while. We look forward to you joining us again tomorrow for our second day filled with learning and conversations. Come prepared to learn and to engage. We start at 9:30 with morning worship. And now, as you leave this place, may you find rainbows of hope. May you see sparkles of joy. May you throw kindness around like confetti. And may the love of God, the grace of Jesus, and the comfort of the Holy Spirit be with each one of you. Go in peace.